Here is your next story.
The scent of expensive wood smoke and cold iron always filled Sangbum's office, a reminder that I was in the presence of a predator. But the gold-embossed envelope the courier just handed me smelled like something far worse. My past. Cello hadn't just invited me to his wedding, he'd sent an invitation to my own public execution. I felt the weight of the heavy, cream-colored cardstock between my thumb and forefinger. It was absurdly thick, the kind of paper that screamed old money aspirations. My eyes scanned the elegant calligraphy, landing on the handwritten note tucked into the corner of the inner flap. Rethabile, I know how hard it is for you to let go, but please try to be happy for us. Don't come alone and embarrass me again. It would be a shame for the staff to have to escort you out. Welcome back, my dangerous dreamers. Today we aren't just talking about love, we're talking about the cost of disrespect. We've all been the person who was thrown away once someone else climbed a little higher. But what happens when the person they threw away becomes the person they can no longer touch? If you're ready to see a social climber meet a real king, hit that like button and subscribe. Grab your tea, dim the lights, and let's watch the sparks fly. Let's begin. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, the kind of silence that had a physical weight to it. We were on the 60th floor of the Keon Global Tower, a glass and steel monolith that pierced the low-hanging clouds of a rainy Seoul afternoon. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was a blurred watercolor of charcoal grays and neon blues, the rain slicking the streets far below into shimmering ribbons of light. I sat at the massive obsidian table, its surface so polished it acted as a black mirror, reflecting the flickering city lights and the sharp, dangerous silhouette of the man sitting across from me. My fingers traced the raised gold ink of the invitation, my nails painted a deep, professional burgundy, clicking softly against the paper. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, a slow burning fuse of humiliation and rage. Cello knew exactly which buttons to press. He knew that after 3 years of building his life, of being the silent engine behind his social ascent, his suggestion that I was a clinger would cut deeper than any physical blade. I forced my breathing to remain steady, the air in the room tasting of ozone and filtered oxygen. As an elite fixer, my face was my greatest asset, a mask of serene, untouchable competence. But the cardstock was trembling, only a fraction of a millimeter. But in this room, under his gaze, it might as well have been a flag of surrender. Xian Sang-boom hadn't moved. He sat at the head of the table, a predator carved from granite. His broad shoulders filled the high-backed leather chair, his charcoal gray suit tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. He didn't lean back. He loomed, even while seated. His hands, large and scarred across the knuckles, rested flat on the obsidian surface, framing the logistics contract we had been finalizing seconds before the courier interrupted. I felt his eyes on me. They weren't just dark. They were obsidian, devoid of light, cataloging every micro-expression on my face. Sangbum didn't just see people. He dismantled them. The contract, his voice broke the silence, a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to hum through the table and into my very bones. It is signed, Rethabile. Our business is concluded for the day. Yes, I managed, my voice crisp, though my throat felt like it was lined with glass. I began to tuck the invitation back into its envelope, my movements hurried. My apologies for the interruption, Chairman. I'll see myself out. I started to rise, the heels of my Louboutins clicking against the marble floor as I pushed my chair back. The sound was too loud, too frantic. I reached for my leather portfolio, but before I could retreat, the air in the room shifted. It was like the drop in pressure before a massive storm. Sangbum stood. The movement was fluid, terrifyingly graceful for a man of his size. He didn't just stand, he claimed the space. He walked around the perimeter of the table, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. I froze, my hand hovering over my bag. He stopped inches from me, his presence an invisible wall of heat and dominance. He was significantly taller than me, forcing me to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. Up close, the scent of wood smoke was intoxicating, masking the faint metallic tang of the rain outside. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out, his large hand eclipsed mine as he took the gold-embossed envelope from my grasp. His skin was warm, his touch possessive. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs, as he pulled the card out. He didn't just read it, he consumed the information. His jaw tightened, the muscles there corded like steel cables. I saw the moment he reached Cello's handwritten insult. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Sangbum's eyes turned pitch black, the pupils dilating until the iris vanished entirely. This wasn't the billionaire VC looking at a piece of mail. This was the ghost king of the Korean underworld looking at a target. Cello, he murmured the name, and it sounded like a death sentence. The man you spent 3 years elevating. The man who thinks he can invite a queen to a stable and expect her to thank him for the hay. It's nothing, I lied, my professional mask cracking. Just a pathetic attempt at a power play. I'm not going, obviously. I have no reason to be in Cape Town for a wedding that serves as a mockery of everything I built for him. Sangbum stepped closer, invading my personal space until I could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat. He held the invitation between 2 fingers, looking at it with utter disdain before his gaze snapped back to mine. The intensity was blinding. He saw the vengeful streak I hid so well, he saw the fire behind my professional perfection, and for the first time, he reached out and stoked it. "You are a fixer, Rethable," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous silky whisper that raised the hair on my arms. "You solve problems for the elite. You bury scandals. You create legends. And yet, you allow this insect to believe he has outgrown your shadow." He reached out with his free hand, his thumb grazing my jawline. It was a calculated territorial gesture. I should have pulled away, but I was anchored by the sheer gravity of him. My breath hitched as his fingers moved to the nape of my neck, tilting my head up further. "He told you not to come alone," Sangbum noted, his thumb pressing just firmly enough against my pulse point to feel it racing. "He wants to show his new world that you are a relic of his past. He wants a spectacle of your loneliness." He crumpled the expensive, cream-colored envelope in his fist, the sound of the paper groaning echoing through the silent boardroom. He tossed the ruined paper onto the obsidian table like trash. "He wants a show?" Sangbum's eyes locked onto mine with a possessive clarity that made my knees weak. "We will give him a massacre. I am your +1, Rethabai, and I don't play the part of a guest." The silence following Sangbum's declaration wasn't empty, it was pressurized, like the air inside a diving bell. He didn't wait for my consent. He knew that in my world, silence was the ultimate form of agreement. He turned, the heavy fabric of his suit jacket shifting over his broad shoulders, and gestured toward the double mahogany doors. "We leave," he commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. I grabbed my leather portfolio, my fingers still tingling from where his skin had brushed mine. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs, but I forced my legs to move with the grace of the woman I had spent a decade becoming. Every step I took across the polished marble of the executive suite felt heavier than the last. I was no longer just a consultant. I was an accomplice to something dark and inevitable. As the doors swung open, the shadows appeared. They didn't walk into the hallway, they materialized. 4 men in identical black suits, their earpieces glinting under the recessed lighting, formed a diamond perimeter around us. They didn't speak. They didn't even look at me. They moved like a single, lethal organism, their footfalls synchronized with Sangbum's heavy, deliberate stride. I walked at his side, feeling the sheer physical gravity of the man. He was a sun, and I was being pulled into his orbit, willing or not. We reached the private elevator bank, a secluded alcove guarded by 2 more men. Songbum pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner. The doors slid open with a soft, expensive hiss. The descent was a sensory blur. As the high-speed lift plummeted from the 60th floor, the pressure change hit my ears with a dull pop. I watched the digital floor counter blur, 50, 40, 30, while the reflection in the mirrored walls showed a striking contrast. There I was, elegant in my tailored cream blazer and sleek black trousers, a woman of intellect and strategy, and beside me stood a man who looked like he could crush a throat with a single hand. When the doors opened at the sub-basement executive garage, the quiet of the office was replaced by the low industrial hum of the building's ventilation and the distant roar of Seoul's traffic echoing through the concrete. The air here was thicker, humid with the scent of wet asphalt and exhaust. A fleet of 3 black vehicles waited. In the center was the armored Maybach, its obsidian paint job so deep it seemed to swallow the overhead fluorescent lights. A driver, gloved and stone-faced, held the rear door open. Sang Boom waited for me to slide in first. I moved into the cabin, the scent of his world immediately enveloping me. It was a heady mix of sandalwood, expensive cognac, and the faint, cold smell of rain dampened leather. The upholstery was butter-soft, a deep charcoal that felt like a caress against my skin. He climbed in beside me, his massive frame making the spacious interior feel suddenly intimate. The door closed with a heavy, vacuum-sealed thud, instantly killing the noise of the garage. It was a tomb of luxury. The car pulled away, the motion so smooth I only knew we were moving by the way the garage lights streaked across the tinted windows. "You're quiet," Rethabile, Sang Bum said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the seat. He didn't look at me, he was looking at a tablet, his profile sharp and unforgiving in the dim cabin light. "I'm calculating the risk," I replied, smoothing the fabric of my trousers. "You don't play the part of a guest for free. What is the price of a king's presence at a wedding in Cape Town?" He turned his head then, his obsidian eyes catching the flash of a passing neon sign. "Intelligence is why I hired you for the logistics deal. It's also why I'm taking you to South Africa. This isn't charity. I have a merger pending with the Hyundai Group. They are traditionalists, men who believe that a bachelor is an unstable element. They want to see a man who has a woman capable of standing at his side, not behind him. A queen who can navigate a boardroom and a gala with equal lethality." "A contract marriage?" I asked, my brow arching. "A contract partnership," he corrected. "For the duration of this trip, you are mine. In exchange, I dismantle the man who thinks he can disrespect my partner. I want Cello to see exactly what he threw away, and I want him to realize he can never touch it again." I looked out the window as we hit the main artery of Gangnam. The neon lights of the city, vibrant pinks, electric blues, and searing yellows washed over the interior of the car. The rain was heavier now, drumming a rhythmic, muffled beat against the reinforced glass. As the lights blurred, I felt the phantom ache of a memory I usually kept locked in a lead-lined box. 6 months ago. The penthouse I had, curated for us. The rain had been just as heavy then. I had come home with a bottle of vintage champagne to celebrate Cello's promotion, a promotion I had secured by blackmailing the rival candidate with his own offshore accounts. I found Cello standing in the center of the living room, his bags packed. He didn't look guilty, he looked bored. "You're too much, Rethabile," he had said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth he'd used when he needed me to fix his messes. "You're too professional, too intimidating. When I look at you, I feel like I'm looking at a business plan, not a wife. I need someone who makes me feel powerful, not someone who reminds me I'm only here because of her brilliance." He had left me in the apartment I paid for, with the furniture I chose, to go to a woman whose only talent was having a father with a 300-year-old surname. The memory recoiled as Songboom's hand suddenly rested on the center console, inches from mine. His presence was the antithesis of Cello's. Cello wanted a mirror to reflect his ego. Songboom wanted a weapon to complement his power. "The snake thought you were too much," Songboom said, as if he could read the dark thoughts swirling in my mind. He was right. You were far too much for a small man. But for me, you are just enough. The car slowed, turning into the private gated driveway of my apartment complex. It was a fortress of glass overlooking the Han River, but today, the entrance looked different. The valet, a young man who usually greeted me with a polite nod, stood frozen on the sidewalk. His face was pale as he stared at the motorcade. 3 armored SUVs and a Maybach didn't just visit this neighborhood, they occupied it. He looked like he wanted to run, his eyes darting between the lead security vehicle and the dark glass of our car. The Maybach came to a controlled halt. The lead shadow was out of his vehicle before our wheels had even stopped turning, his hand hovering near his jacket as he scanned the perimeter. "We are here," Sangbum said, finally closing his tablet. He looked at me, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Go get your dossier. Show me the man we are going to destroy." I stepped out of the car, the cool, rain-scented air hitting my face. I didn't look back at the terrified valet. I walked toward the lobby, knowing that the man following me wasn't a boyfriend or a fiancé. He was a force of nature I had just unleashed on the world. The lobby of my building was a cathedral of brushed steel and silent judgment. Usually, the air-conditioned stillness offered me a sense of control, but as Sang Bum walked beside me, his heavy boots thudding against the white marble, the space felt too small. The night concierge didn't even ask for his ID. He simply bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the desk, his hands trembling as he held the override key for my private elevator. We stepped into the lift. The doors slid shut with a muted chime, sealing us into a box of mirrors and wood paneling. I could see us reflected a dozen times, the elegant, sharp-edged fixer and the massive, predatory king. I caught myself watching the way his chest expanded with every slow, measured breath. The elevator rose with a stomach-flipping lurch, the digital display glowing a steady cold blue as it climbed toward the penthouse. When the doors opened directly into my foyer, the scent of beige candles, black currant and Bulgarian rose, greeted us. My apartment was a masterpiece of clinical, high-tech minimalism. No family photos, no soft edges, just floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Han River, which looked like a vein of liquid silver under the battering rain. "Your sanctuary," Sang Bum rumbled, stepping past me. He didn't wait to be invited. He moved through the open-plan living area, his presence a dark stain on my white leather Minotti sofa. He looked entirely out of place, a wolf in a glass gallery. He stopped at the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking down at the city as if he already owned every light in the skyline. "It's a fortress," I replied, setting my portfolio on the obsidian dining table. "I don't let people in here," Sang Bum. "I know," he said, turning back to me. His eyes were unreadable. A fixer with a secret heart. A dangerous thing to have in our world. I ignored the bait and went to the kitchen island, my movements precise as I poured 2 fingers of a rare hibiki into lead crystal tumblers. The ice clinked, a sharp, lonely sound in the quiet room. I brought the glasses over, setting one in front of him before spreading out the physical files and 3 synchronized tablets. "Let's work," I said, my voice tight. We sat at the long obsidian table, the surface cold against my forearms. I flicked a finger across the tablet, projecting the image of Cello and his bride-to-be, Annika van der Merwe, onto the wall-sized screen. Cello looked smug, his arm draped around Annika, a blonde, porcelain-faced heiress whose family owned a sprawling wine empire in Stellenbosch. "The van der Merwe family," I began, my professional mask firmly back in place. "They claim 300 years of clean viticulture. But Cello didn't just marry for the name. He married for the debt. The estate is leveraged to the hilt. They've been using a series of offshore accounts in the Caymans to hide a massive shortfall in their production exports." Sang Bum leaned in, his shoulder brushing mine. The heat radiating from him was a physical force, a contrast to the chilled air of the penthouse. He took the tablet from my hand, his large fingers tracing the flow of the financial charts I had painstakingly mapped. "You've played this like a banker, Rethabile," he murmured, his voice a low vibration in the space between us. "You've found the cracks in the foundation. But you're thinking about a lawsuit. I'm thinking about a collapse." He leaned closer to the screen, his scent, wood smoke and cold iron, overpowering the rose candles. "Look at the logistics firm they use for the European exports. Vanguard Shipping." I frowned, leaning in to follow his gaze. My hair brushed against the fabric of his suit. I looked at them. "They're a standard third-party carrier." "No," Sang Bum said, his voice dropping an octave. He tapped a specific sub-entry in the digital ledger, his nail clicking against the glass. "They are a shell company, registered in Macau. They don't just ship wine, Rethabile, they ship favors for the triads. And I know the man who owns the parent company." The air in the room seemed to vanish. I looked at the numbers again, my mind racing. If Vanguard is tied to Macau, and the van der Merwes are using them to bypass export taxes, then they aren't just tax evaders, Sang Bum finished, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his face. "They are laundering money for a syndicate that makes the Korean Mafia look like schoolboys." And the owner of that parent company? He owes me a life debt from a botched port deal 5 years ago. I felt a shiver of pure, cold adrenaline. This was the difference between us. I was a surgeon, cutting out the cancer. He was the god of the storm, ready to level the entire hospital. So, I whispered, turning my head to look at him. He was already looking at me, his face inches from mine. With one phone call, you can freeze their entire supply chain? With one phone call, he said, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. I can make it so that by the time they reach the altar, the Vandermeer name is worth less than the paper this invitation is printed on. Cello isn't marrying into a fortune, he's marrying into a funeral. The silence that followed was electric. I could hear the rain lashing against the glass, the hum of the refrigerator, and the heavy, synchronized thud of our hearts. My hand was resting on the table, and Sangboom slowly covered it with his own. His palm was broad and rough, pinning my hand to the obsidian surface. I didn't pull away. The heat from his skin was the only thing keeping me grounded in a world that was suddenly spinning. "Why help me this much?" I asked, my voice barely a breath. "The merger doesn't require the total annihilation of a South African wine family." "Because you asked," he said simply. "And because I find I dislike the idea of anyone thinking they can take something from you and survive." He stood up abruptly, the movement breaking the spell. The sudden absence of his heat made me feel exposed. I watched him walk to the window again, the first faint light of dawn beginning to bleed through the soul fog, turning the sky a bruised, hazy purple. He turned and walked toward the foyer, his long dark coat billowing slightly. I followed him, my legs feeling heavy, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up to me. At the door, he stopped. He reached out, his fingers catching my chin, tilting my face up so I had no choice but to meet his obsidian gaze. His touch was firm, possessive, a silent promise of the chaos to come. "Sleep, Rethabile," he said, his voice a dark caress. "Tomorrow, we start the physical transformation. We need to prepare the world for what you are about to become." He leaned in, his lips hovering just a hair's breadth from my ear. "By the time we land in Cape Town, Cello won't just be an ex, he'll be a ghost." He let go of my chin and stepped into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, I stood in the foyer of my silent, cold fortress, the taste of his wood smoke still on my skin, and for the first time in 6 months, I didn't feel like a woman who had been thrown away. I felt like a woman who was being armed. The transition from the sanctuary of my penthouse to the reality of Sangbum's world felt like stepping into a cold, fast-moving current. 2 days had passed in a blur of encrypted calls and tactical planning, but today, the plan required a physical form. The drive through Gangnam was a sensory overload of neon and glass. It was late afternoon, the sun a dying ember behind a thick veil of smog, turning the city into a wash of hazy orange and bruised violet. We sat in the back of the Maybach, the silence between us heavy with the weight of things unsaid. Sangboom was dressed in a suit of such deep navy it was nearly black, his presence making the expansive cabin feel claustrophobic. I watched the city fly by, a blur of luxury boutiques and crowded intersections, until we veered away from the main strips. We pulled up to an unassuming, reinforced concrete structure tucked behind a high-end art gallery. It looked like a brutalist bank vault, windowless and cold. There were no signs, no logos. Just a single, massive steel door and 2 shadows standing guard, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses. The descent was made in a heavy-duty freight elevator. There was no polished wood here, only industrial steel and the rhythmic clank of chains. As we dropped, the temperature cooled, the air growing crisp and sterile. When the doors finally groaned open, my breath hitched. This was not a retail store. It was the subterranean palace of the Keon family's private image architects. The armory was a cavernous space of raw concrete and polished chrome, illuminated by soft, recessed lighting that made the racks of garments look like museum exhibits. The air smelled of expensive mulberry silk, raw leather, and the faint, sharp sting of tailoring chemicals. A dozen staff members moved like ghosts, silent, efficient, and dressed in monochromatic black. They bowed in perfect unison as Sangbum stepped out, but they didn't look at him. Their eyes were on me. "She needs to be redefined," Songbom's voice echoed through the vast space, a low, authoritative rumble. No pastel, no lace, no pretty distractions. We are not dressing a bride, we are arming a sovereign. The head architect, a woman with silver hair pulled into a knot so tight it looked painful, nodded once. I was led to a raised circular dais in the center of the room, surrounded by triptych mirrors that stretched toward the high ceiling. I felt exposed, a specimen under a microscope. Usually, as a fixer, I wore high-end but forgettable suits, clothes meant to help me blend into the shadows of the elite. Songbum stood at the edge of the dais, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his eyes narrowed as the staff began to bring out options. He rejected the first 6 with a sharp flick of his wrist. A gold silk gown was too soft. A red velvet piece was too desperate. She is not seeking attention, Songbum said, stepping onto the dais. The staff scrambled back, creating a vacuum of space around us. She is commanding it. He reached into a rack that had been brought from the back, a vault within a vault. He pulled out a gown of shimmering obsidian liquid silk. It wasn't just black, it was the color of a starless sky, with a subtle bruised emerald undertone that only appeared when the light hit the folds. "Put this on," he commanded. In the dressing room, the fabric felt like ice against my skin. It was heavy, weighted with a quality of silk I hadn't known existed. As I stepped back out onto the dais, the mirrors caught my reflection from every angle. The dress clung to my curves like a second skin, the neckline a sharp architectural plunge, the sleeves long and tapering into points over my knuckles. But the most striking detail was the high, dangerous slit on the left thigh. As I moved, I noticed a discreet, reinforced pocket hidden within the interior silk lining. Songbum stepped toward me, reaching into his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, lethal object, a slim dagger made of polished black obsidian, its hilt wrapped in textured ray skin. "A gift," he whispered, sliding the blade into the hidden sheath against my thigh. The cool stone felt like a secret against my skin, for the moments when words are not enough. Next came the jewelry. A ghost-like assistant brought forward a velvet-lined case. Inside lay a necklace of raw, uncut emeralds, each the size of a thumbprint, trapped in a web of blackened gold. These weren't sparkling gems. They were deep, dark, and ancient. They looked like something pulled from the heart of a mountain. "These stayed in my family's vault for 3 generations, Songbum said. He took the necklace from the case, the metal clinking softly. "They are only worn by those under the direct protection of the Ghost King." He stepped behind me. I watched our reflection in the triptych mirrors. The contrast was suffocating, the deep mahogany of my skin against the pale, scarred texture of his large hands. My breath caught as he reached around, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin of my neck as he fastened the heavy clasp. The heat from his body was a physical weight. He didn't pull away once the necklace was secure. Instead, he rested his hands on my shoulders, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine in the reflection. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with a sudden, electric tension. I could hear the steady, slow thrum of his heart against my back. I looked at the woman in the mirror. I didn't recognize her. The fixer was gone, buried under layers of obsidian silk and ancient emeralds. In her place was something terrifyingly beautiful, a queen of the underworld. "You look like a war about to happen," Songbum murmured, his lips inches from my ear. His grip on my shoulders tightened, a territorial claim that made a shiver of pure, dark adrenaline race down my spine. I turned in his arms, my hand resting on the broad expanse of his chest. I could feel the power radiating off him, the sheer, unshakable confidence of a man who broke worlds to get what he wanted. "Is this what you wanted?" I asked, my voice a low, ragged thread. "To turn me into a weapon? I didn't turn you into anything." "Rethabil," he said, his gaze dropping to my mouth. "I simply stripped away the mask you were using to hide. This is who you always were. Now the rest of the world has to deal with it." We left the vault as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the city outside now a fever dream of neon. As we climbed back into the Maybach, the armored door sealing us into our private, sandalwood-scented tomb, Songbum looked at me. The shadows of the passing streetlights danced across the sharp angles of his face. "The world is going to stare, Rethabili," he said, his voice a dark, velvet promise. Let them. You were never meant to be a background character in a weak man's story. You were meant to be the climax. I looked out at the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, the obsidian blade heavy against my thigh, and the emeralds cold against my throat. Cello wanted me to be embarrassed? He wanted me to come alone? He had no idea that he hadn't just invited an ex-girlfriend. He had invited the end of his world. The transition from the subterranean vaults of Gangnam to the private hangar at Incheon was a blur of tactical silence. The armored Maybach glided onto the tarmac, coming to a halt beneath the towering shadow of a matte black Gulfstream G700. It wasn't just a plane. It was a mobile command center, the silver phoenix of the Kaon family crest etched onto the tail like a threat. The air outside was biting, smelling of sea salt and high-octane fuel. I followed Sangbum up the air stair, the heels of my boots clicking sharply against the metal. 2 flight attendants stood at the entrance, their faces masks of professional neutrality, bowing so low they seemed to fold in half. "Welcome, Chairman. Welcome, Miss Valentine," they murmured. I stepped into the cabin, and the world changed. The interior was an exercise in dark, masculine luxury, deep mahogany panels, cream silk wool carpeting, and a conference table made of a single slab of obsidian-veined marble. The scent was immediate, aged Yamazaki whiskey, and the faint ozonic crispness of filtered air. As we taxied, a flight attendant moved with ghost-like efficiency, taking our coats and offering warm, eucalyptus-scented towels. I settled into a wide, hand-stitched leather seat that felt more like a throne. Sang-boom sat across from me, shedding his suit jacket. He was wearing a black cashmere sweater that hugged his broad shoulders and chest, the soft fabric doing nothing to hide the lethal power of his frame. It made him look approachable, a dangerous illusion. The engines roared to life, a muffled, powerful vibration that I felt in my molars. As we lifted off, the cabin tilted, and I watched the neon grid of Seoul shrink into a shimmering carpet of light before being swallowed by the clouds. Once the fasten seatbelt sign chimed off at 40,000 feet, the staff retreated behind a heavy curtain, leaving us in a tomb of high-altitude silence. Sangbum didn't reach for a drink. He reached for a tablet. "Come here," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that cut through the white noise of the engines. I unbuckled and moved to the marble table, sitting in the chair adjacent to him. The proximity was startling. In the dim, recessed amber lighting of the cabin, the tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe as he moved. He slid a tablet toward me, showing a series of red and green tickers. "Cello's tech startup, Ascend Logistics," Sangbum said, his thumb tracing a sharp downward spike on a graph. He spent the last 6 months inflating its valuation to impress the Van der Merwis. He's used their family name as collateral to secure a massive line of credit from a private equity firm in Singapore. "I know that firm," I said, my fixer brain clicking into gear. "They're aggressive. If the valuation drops below a certain threshold, they can trigger an immediate margin call." "Exactly." Sangbum leaned in, the scent of wood smoke and cashmere enveloping me. I spent the last 2 hours shorting his stock through 3 different shell companies. By the time we cross the Indian Ocean, his board of directors will receive an anonymous tip regarding irregularities in his user growth data. The compliance errors I've leaked to the Van der Merwe family's lead counsel will make him look like a liability, not a genius. I watched the screen. It was digital carnage. We were systematically dismantling the bridge he had built to his new life while we were 7 miles above the earth. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the table. A notification from the wedding WhatsApp group. A group I had muted but hadn't left, keeping it as a window into the enemy camp. "Cello, is anyone else having trouble with the banking apps in CT? Minor glitch, I'm sure. Looking forward to seeing everyone at the rehearsal dinner tonight. It's going to be legendary." I felt a dark, cold thrill of satisfaction. "He's noticing the frost," I whispered, showing the screen to Sangbum. "He thinks it's a glitch. He has no idea the sun has already set on his credit. He's a small man playing a big man's game," Sangbum said dismissively. He signaled to the galley, and a moment later, a flight attendant appeared, placing a crystal decanter of Yamazaki and 2 glasses on the table before vanishing again. The cabin lights dimmed further as we hit a patch of light turbulence. The plane shuddered, a gentle rhythmic swaying. I reached for my glass, my fingers brushing Sang Bum's as we both reached for the decanter. The contact was electric, a jolt of heat that made my breath hitch. He didn't pull away. He let his hand linger over mine, his obsidian eyes searching my face. "Why do you do it, Rethabil?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You could have taken a settlement. You could have lived a quiet, wealthy life in London or Paris. Why chase the ghost of a man who wasn't worth your shadow?" I took a slow sip of the whiskey, the peat and smoke burning pleasantly down my throat. I looked out the window at the black void of the sky. "Because power is the only thing that's real," I said, turning back to him. "Cello didn't just leave me. He tried to erase me. He tried to rewrite the history of his success, to exclude the woman who built it. In our world, if you aren't the one holding the blade, you're the one being carved. I chose the blade a long time ago." Sang Bum nodded slowly, a look of grim understanding in his eyes. Safety is a lie sold to the middle class. For people like us, there is only the throne or the grave. I like your fire, Rethabil. It matches the coldness in my own blood. He leaned closer, his face inches from mine. The physical tension was suffocating, a taut wire stretched between us. I could see the faint scar near his temple, the predatory curve of his lips. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me, and I realized with a start that I wouldn't stop him. But he simply reached past me, his arm grazing mine, to close the lid of my laptop. "Rest now," he said, his voice a dark caress. "The massacre requires you to be sharp." I retreated to the oversized sleeper berth in the back of the cabin. As I lay there, the muffled roar of the jet became a lullaby. Every few hours I would wake to the feeling of a turn or the slight change in engine pitch. Once, I peered through the curtain and saw Sang Bum still at the table, a lone figure in the dark, bathed in the blue light of a monitor, moving pieces on a global chessboard. Hours later, the cabin began to brighten with a sharp, piercing light. I sat up, pushing back the silk duvet. The flight attendant appeared with a tray of fresh Kona coffee and sliced dragon fruit. "We are beginning our descent into Cape Town, Miss Valentine." I moved to the window. The neon, rain-slicked world of Seoul was a lifetime away. Below us, the Atlantic Ocean was a vast sheet of crinkled cobalt, and rising out of the mist was the unmistakable, flat-topped silhouette of Table Mountain. The sunlight here was different, honest, harsh, and blindingly bright. It didn't hide anything. Sang Bum was already dressed in a fresh suit, his tie knotted with military precision. He stood by the door as the wheels hit the tarmac with a puff of blue smoke. The jet taxied toward a private terminal where 3 armored black SUVs were already idling, their engines humming in wait. The stairs lowered, and the heat of the South African morning rushed in, a dry Finbo's-scented warmth that tasted of salt and earth. Sang Bum stepped onto the tarmac first, his presence immediately commanding the attention of the local security detail. He turned back, offering me his hand. As I took it, the gold-embossed invitation, the one that had started this entire war, lay forgotten on the mahogany table inside the plane. He looked at the mountain, then back at me, his eyes twin voids of dark intent. "The air in Cape Town is too clean, Rethabil," he said, his voice a promise of the storm to come. "Let's fill it with the scent of his regret." We moved toward the lead SUV. The driver held the door open, and as I slid into the cool leather interior, I felt the obsidian blade against my thigh. The hunt had officially moved from the shadows of the internet to the soil beneath our feet. The drive from the Cape Town International Airport was a study in clinical efficiency. The 3-car motorcade moved through the highway traffic like a shark through a school of minnows, the lead SUV clearing a path that local drivers were too intimidated to block. I watched out the window as the landscape shifted from the flat, scrubby plains of the Cape Flats to the jagged, breathtaking majesty of the mountain, but my mind was in the lobby of the Silo Hotel. The motorcade turned into the V&A waterfront, the tires humming over the brick-paved roads. We pulled up to the Silo, an architectural marvel of concrete and pillowed geometric glass windows that bulged outward like diamonds. It was a monument to industrial chic wealth, the perfect stage for a social climber like Cello to preen. But today, the preening was over. Before our Maybach had even come to a full stop, the lead and rear SUVs disgorged 8 shadows. They moved with a terrifying, silent synchronization, fanning out across the entrance and into the lobby. I saw the hotel's head of security, a man who usually carried himself with a great deal of self-importance, pale visibly. He didn't even reach for his radio, he simply stood back, his hands open and visible, as Songbum's team took control of the perimeter. "Ready?" Songbum asked. He hadn't touched his seatbelt yet. He was watching me, his eyes searching for any flicker of the girl Cello had discarded. "I was born ready for this," I said, my voice as cool as the air-conditioned cabin. The door was opened from the outside. I stepped out into the sharp, golden Cape Town sun. I had chosen a travel outfit that was an exercise in quiet lethality, a tailored cream silk set, the trousers flowing around my legs like liquid, the blazer sharp-shouldered and cinched. Against the deep mahogany of my skin, the cream silk glowed. And there, visible in the plunging neckline of the camisole, were the Keon emeralds, dark, ancient, and screaming of a tax bracket Cello couldn't even dream of. Sangbum stepped out behind me. He didn't offer his hand. He simply occupied the space at my side, his presence a dark, looming shadow that made the sunlight feel colder. We walked through the revolving glass doors. The lobby was a soaring space of exposed piping and high-end art, but all eyes were on the perimeter of black-suited men guarding the path to the elevators. And then I saw him. Cello was standing at the Granary Caf bar, surrounded by 3 of his groomsmen, men with names like Peter and Johann, whose families owned half the vineyards in the valley. Cello was holding a glass of high-end scotch, laughing at something Peter had said, leaning back with the practiced ease of a man who thought he had finally arrived. Then he saw me. The laughter didn't just stop, it died a violent death. I watched the physical glitch take over his body. His smile froze, then twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His hand trembled, the scotch sloshing against the rim of the glass with a sharp clink, clink, clink that I could hear from across the room. The men beside him followed his gaze, their conversations tapering off into an awkward, heavy silence. I didn't slow down. I walked toward the private elevator bank, my head held high, my eyes fixed on the destination. Cello, driven by a decade of habit and a desperate need to reclaim his dominance, set his glass down on the marble bar and stepped forward. He straightened his blazer, trying to summon the concerned ex-persona he had used to gaslight me for years. "Rethabile?" He called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Rethabile, what is all this?" He tried to intercept us, his hand reaching out as if to grab my arm. He never got within 3 feet. 2 shadows stepped into his path, their movements so fast they were a blur. They didn't draw weapons, they simply stood like stone walls. One of them placed a gloved hand on Cello's chest, a soft, firm correction that sent Cello stumbling back a step. "Sir, stay back," the shadow said, his voice a flat, robotic monotone. "Rethabile," Cello hissed, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red as his wealthy friends watched the exchange. "What the hell is going on? Who are these people? You can't just come in here and—" Songbum didn't stop. He didn't even slow his pace. He treated Cello with the absolute crushing indifference one might show to a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of a shoe. He didn't look at the man. He didn't acknowledge his existence. I looked at Cello then. In the presence of Sangbum, he looked small, shrunken. His bespoke suit, which he had bragged about in the group chat, looked cheap and ill-fitting. His skin looked sallow in the unforgiving light of the lobby. I felt a surge of cold, fixer-like clarity. This was the man I had built? This was the man I had cried over? He was a footnote. Rethabile. Cello barked again, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to be heard over the hum of the lobby's air conditioning. "Talk to me." Sangbum stopped. The entire lobby went silent. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Sangbum didn't turn his body, he stayed facing the elevator. But he turned his head just enough for Cello to see the edge of his profile, the sharp jaw, the dark dragon tattoo, and an eye that held the coldness of a deep sea trench. "You are speaking to my partner," Sangbum said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room, vibrating with a lethal, quiet authority. "You have not been granted permission to address her." Cello's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. He looked at Peter and Johann, seeking some kind of support, but they were already stepping back, their eyes wide with the realization that they weren't looking at a +1. They were looking at the kind of power that could erase their family legacies with a single phone call. But I'm the groom, Cello stammered, his voice pathetic. I invited her. A mistake you will live to regret, Songbum murmured. The private elevator chimed. The gold doors slid open. I stepped inside, the plush carpet beneath my feet feeling like the first step onto a battlefield. Songbum stepped in beside me, turning to face the lobby. I watched Cello as the doors began to close. He was standing there, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple, his hands twitching at his sides. He looked terrified. He looked exposed. He looked like the social climber who had finally reached the top of the mountain only to find a dragon waiting for him. The doors hissed shut on his shocked, sweating face. The elevator began its silent, smooth ascent to the royal suite. For a moment, it was just the two of us in the mirrored box. The tension from the lobby followed us in, a heavy electric heat. Songbum stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his reflection multiplied infinitely in the glass. He turned to me, his obsidian eyes softening just a fraction, the only sign of the man behind the king. He reached out, his thumb grazing the emerald at my throat. He's already breathing like a man underwater, Songbum said, his voice a dark, silky promise. Tonight, at the dinner, we let him drown. I looked at my own reflection, at the woman in cream silk and ancient gems, and I didn't feel the sting of the wedding invitation anymore. I felt the weight of the crown. Let's make sure the water is ice cold, I replied. The drive from the V&A waterfront to the rolling hills of Stellenbosch was a 40-minute descent into the heart of South African aristocracy. The sun had long since dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Jonkershoek Mountains, leaving the sky a deep, bruised indigo. As our motorcade wound through the moonlit vines, the smell of the evening drifted through the cracked window of the Maybach, a heady, intoxicating cocktail of night, blooming jasmine, damp earth, and the sweet, fermenting scent of ripening grapes. We turned into the Van der Merwe estate, a sprawling Cape Dutch manor with whitewashed gables that glowed like bone under the floodlights. This was old money manifested in stone and soil. The gravel crunched beneath our tires, a sharp, rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown. The architecture is meant to intimidate, I whispered, adjusting the heavy silk of my obsidian gown. It's meant to tell you that these people have been here longer than your ancestors have been free. Songbum sat beside me, his silhouette a solid, terrifying block of shadow. He reached out, his hand covering my knee, his thumb pressing firmly into the silk, just inches from where the obsidian blade was strapped to my thigh. Ancestry is just a story people tell themselves when they lack the power to create a future, he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. Tonight we write a new story. The door was opened by a valet who didn't dare make eye contact. As I stepped out, the obsidian liquid silk of the gown rippled like oil on water. The high-set plunge of the neckline caught the moonlight, and the Keon emeralds at my throat glowed with a dark, verdant fire. I felt the weight of the dagger against my skin, a secret lethal companion. Songbum stepped out behind me, a silent lethal tower in a bespoke black tuxedo that seemed to absorb the light around him. We entered the manor. The rehearsal dinner was set in the grand dining hall, a room of dark oak beams and flickering candlelight. Cello was at the head of the long table, dressed in a white tie ensemble that screamed of desperate effort. He was laughing too loudly, his arm draped around Claire, the porcelain-faced heiress who looked more like a trophy than a bride. The room didn't just go quiet when we entered. It exhaled. The shift in the social atmosphere was instantaneous and violent. Cello's father-in-law, Peter van der Merwe, a man whose face was a map of sun-damaged privilege, stood up abruptly. I watched his eyes travel from my face to the emeralds, then finally to the man at my side. His jaw dropped. He didn't just recognize Songbum. He looked like he had seen a god walk into a temple of clay. Chairman Keon? Peter stammered, his voice carrying across the silent hall. He ignored Cello completely, stepping away from the head of the table as if the groom didn't exist. We were told you were in the country, but we never dreamed. The billionaires and vineyard owners who had been surrounding Cello seconds ago began to drift away from him like iron filings pulled by a more powerful magnet. They crowded around us, their voices a hushed, reverent murmur, desperate for a moment of the Ghost King's attention. Cello stood frozen. The ego he had tried so hard to rebuild in the lobby that afternoon was visibly crumbling. He looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, the realization dawning on him that he wasn't the main character of this evening. He was the background noise. We were seated. I sat to the right of the Vander Merwe patriarch, while Songboom sat across from me, his gaze never leaving mine. As the first course, a delicate smoked trout was served, the first strike landed. It started with a soft buzz on the table. Then another. Cello's phone was vibrating incessantly. I watched him. At first, he tried to ignore it. A tight, pained smile fixed on his face as he tried to engage Claire in conversation. But the buzzing didn't stop. He finally reached for the phone, his hand trembling so violently that his silver appetizer fork rattled against the fine bone china, a sharp, dissonant sound in the elegant room. I saw the moment the blood left his face. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, and a fine sheen of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The smell of his panic reached me, a sour, metallic scent that cut through the jasmine. He was staring at a notification that his company, Apex Tech, had been delisted from the exchange. His credit lines, the ones he had used to buy the very watch on his wrist, were officially dead. He looked up at me, gasping for air as if the room had suddenly become a vacuum. Rethabile, he choked out, his voice cracking. What did you do? Claire looked at him with mounting disgust. Cello, what is wrong with you? You're making a scene. I stood up slowly, the obsidian silk flowing around me like a shroud. I walked around the table, the heels of my shoes silent on the Persian rug. I stopped behind Cello and Claire, leaning down so that my breath fanned the hair at Claire's ear. It's such a beautiful estate, Claire, I said, my voice a silky, dangerous purr. It would be a shame if the Vander Merwe name was dragged through a Macau-based money laundering scandal. You might want to ask your groom about the Vanguard shipping contracts he signed. He's been using your family's wine exports to move more than just grapes. The silence that followed was absolute. Claire turned to Cello, her eyes narrowing into cold blue slits. Vanguard? Cello, what is she talking about? Cello tried to speak, but no sound came out. He was spiraling publicly, his chest heaving, his hands clutching the edge of the table as his house of cards collapsed in real time. The old money guests began to pull their chairs back, creating a physical gap between themselves and the man who was now a social leper. Sangboom stood up then. He didn't say a word to the guests. He walked over to me, his presence extinguishing any remaining air in Cello's lungs. He placed a hand on the small of my back, a gesture of absolute ownership. At the door of the dining hall, Sangbum stopped. He turned back, looking at the gasping, broken man at the head of the table. You thought she was a tool you could use to climb, Sangbum said, his voice a dark, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor. You didn't realize she was the hand that held the blade. And I am the one who sharpened it. As we walked out into the cool Stellenbosch night, the sounds of Cello's frantic explanations and Claire's rising fury faded behind us. I felt the obsidian blade against my thigh and the heat of the king at my side. One more day, I whispered as the Maybach door closed, sealing us in. Tomorrow, Sangbum replied, we finish him. The digital clock on the bedside table pulsed a cold, rhythmic blue. 3 a.m. In the royal suite of the Silo Hotel, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was a living, breathing thing, heavy with the electricity of the coming dawn. I stood by the towering, pillowed glass windows, my reflection a ghostly overlay against the kaleidoscope of the Cape Town harbor lights. The geometric panes distorted the masts of the yachts below into jagged spears of neon. I was wrapped in a floor-length robe of black silk, the fabric cool and fluid against my skin. In my hand, a glass of water felt like lead. I stared out at the city, watching the slow, rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam across the dark Atlantic. I was dismantling a life out there. Somewhere in the dark, Cello's future was hemorrhaging, and I was the one who had opened the vein. A soft, frantic thudding at the suite's heavy oak door broke the stillness. It wasn't the confident knock of room service or the silent arrival of a shadow. It was the sound of a drowning man hitting the surface of the water. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I watched the door handle turn, then heard the click of a keycard, likely the result of a desperate bribe to a junior staffer who didn't yet realize that crossing Sangbum was a death sentence. The door swung open, and Cello stumbled into the foyer. He looked like a caricature of the man who had stood smugly at the bar that afternoon. His tuxedo jacket was gone, his white shirt was stained with sweat and scotch, and his boatee hung limp around his neck like a noose. His hair, usually styled with nauseating precision, was matted and wild. The social king mask hadn't just slipped, it had been pulverized. "Rethabile," he wheezed, his voice thick with alcohol and terror. He didn't even see me at the window at first. He stood in the center of the dark room, swaying, his eyes darting around the luxury he had hoped to marry into. "Rethi, I know you're in here. Please." I stepped out of the shadows of the window alcove. The movement was slow, deliberate. "You're a long way from the vineyard, Cello. Shouldn't you be getting your beauty sleep for the wedding of the century?" He spun around, nearly losing his balance. "Rethi, thank God." He took a stumbling step toward me, his hands reaching out as if to grab the hem of my robe. I didn't flinch, I simply looked at him with a detachment that seemed to puncture what little pride he had left. "You have to stop this. The banks, they've frozen everything. Peter is asking questions about Vanguard. He's threatening to call off the ceremony. You're the only one who can fix this. You've always fixed things for me." "I used to," I said, my voice as flat as a grave marker. "I built the pedestal you stood on. I didn't realize until lately that I'd built it out of rot. He's using you." Cello suddenly barked, a flash of his old, manipulative self flaring up. He pointed a shaking finger toward the master bedroom. "Cheon, he doesn't care about you. He's a monster, Rethabile. A ghost who kills for sport. You're just a pawn in whatever war he's playing with the Hyundai group. Come back to me. We belong together. We're both from the same dirt, Rethi. We know how to climb." I listened to his words, waiting for the familiar sting of his gaslighting, the old urge to soften my edges to make him feel larger. But all I felt was a profound, cold disgust. I realized then that I had once loved a man who didn't exist. I had loved the potential I had projected onto this hollow, sweating shell. "The difference between us, Cello," I said, taking a sip of the water and feeling the chill in my throat, "is that I don't need to climb anymore. I've arrived, and the only thing we share is the dirt you're about to return to." "You bitch," he whispered, his face twisting. "You're going to let them destroy me, after everything?" He moved toward me, his hand raised in a desperate, drunken rage. He never reached me. From the deepest shadows of the suite, a figure emerged. There was no sound of footsteps, no warning of movement. One moment the air was empty, and the next, Sangbum was standing directly behind Cello. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was in a black silk shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark, coiling ink of the dragons on his chest. In the dim light, he looked like a nightmare made flesh, a silent, obsidian titan. Cello froze. The color drained from his face until he was the shade of old parchment. He didn't even turn around. He simply felt the sudden, crushing weight of Sangbum's presence. He began to tremble, a fine, violent shudder that started in his hands and moved to his knees. "The girl you knew is dead," Sangbum said. His voice was a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. He didn't raise his voice, yet the authority in it was absolute. "You are currently standing in the space of a woman you are not fit to look at." Cello finally turned, his neck creaking like rusted iron. He looked up at Sangbum, and I saw the moment his soul broke. He realized he wasn't in a room with a rival. He was in a cage with a predator who had already decided on the menu. I was just leaving," Cello stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. Sangbum didn't touch him. He didn't have to. He leaned down, his face inches from Cello's. "Here is the reality of your mourning, little man. If you do not show up at that altar, I will find you, and I will erase every trace that you ever breathed this air. If you do show up, you will stand there and watch as the Vander Merwes realize they have bought a corpse. You will sign the papers that hand over your remaining assets to Rethabile's foundation. You are a line of code I am about to delete. Do you understand?" Cello nodded, tears of pure terror leaking from his eyes. He looked like he was about to vomit. Sangbum straightened up, his eyes never leaving Cello's. "Remove him." Two shadows appeared at the door, as silent as the man they served. They grabbed Cello by the elbows, lifting him off the floor as if he weighed nothing. He didn't even fight them. He went limp, his head hanging low as they dragged him out into the hallway. The door closed with a soft, final click. The silence returned, but it was different now, charged with a raw electric heat. I stood by the window, my hand still clutching the glass of water. I felt Songbum move behind me. He didn't stop until his chest was inches from my back, his warmth radiating through the silk of my robe. "You could have stopped him yourself," he murmured, his breath fanning my hair. "I know," I replied, turning to face him, but I wanted to see him realize it for himself. I wanted him to see the king. Sangbum reached out, his hand sliding into the hair at the nape of my neck, his thumb grazing my jaw. He looked out at the horizon, where a thin, pale line of lavender was beginning to break the darkness over the Atlantic. The sun was rising on the day of the wedding. "He came to beg for his life," Sangbum said, his voice a dark, possessive caress. He didn't realize he already lost it the moment he touched that envelope. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. In the quiet of the rising dawn, I realized that I was no longer a fixer for the 1%. I wasn't fixing a scandal or a career. I was the architect of a new empire, and the man holding me was the only one powerful enough to stand in the ruins I created. "Today," I whispered, "we finish it." The transition from the intimacy of the dawn to the cold reality of the wedding morning felt like the sharpening of a blade. There were no frantic bridesmaids in my suite, no giggling friends with champagne. There was only the silent, military precision of Sangbum's staff. I stood still as they draped me in the final layer of my armor, a structured floor-length coat of midnight blue silk worn over the obsidian gown. The Kion emeralds felt heavier today, a verdant weight against my collarbone that reminded me of the price of power. We left the Silo Hotel through a service exit, bypassing the lobby where the remnants of the wedding guests were likely whispering about the previous night's scandal. The armored Maybach was idling, a sleek black beast waiting to carry us to the kill. As we slid into the vacuum-sealed cabin, the scent of Sangbum's sandalwood and the cold metallic tang of the car's armor enveloped me. The drive through the winding streets of Cape Town was a slow-motion descent into history. We passed the colorful houses of Bocop and the stately government buildings, but my eyes were fixed on the spire of St. George's Cathedral. The city was bathed in a harsh, unforgiving light that made every shadow look like a crack in the pavement. When we arrived, the cathedral loomed over us, a Gothic giant of cold, vaulted stone arches and stained glass that seemed to bleed color onto the gray sidewalk. As the heavy oak doors were opened by a shadow, the air that rushed out hit me like a physical blow. It was thick with the cloying sweet rot of 10,000 white lilies, mixed with the ancient, peppery sting of frankincense. "It smells like a funeral," I thought, my heels clicking onto the stone floor. Good. The ceremony had already begun. The organ was humming a low, mournful tone that vibrated in the soles of my feet. Cello was standing at the altar, his back to us. Even from the entrance, I could see the tension in his shoulders. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad, waiting for the command to fire. Claire stood beside him, her white veil a translucent shroud. We didn't slip into a back pew. We didn't wait for an usher. Sangbum placed his hand on the small of my back, and we began the long walk down the center aisle. The sound of our footsteps, the heavy rhythmic thud of his boots, and the sharp lethal strike of my heels echoed off the high stone rafters, cutting through the priest's monotonous drone. Heads began to turn. A ripple of shocked whispers followed us like a wake. We weren't guests. We were the storm. We stopped just behind the front pews, where Peter van der Merwe sat with his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. The priest reached the pivotal moment, his voice echoing through the hollow cathedral. "If any man can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a held breath. Sangbum didn't speak. He didn't have to. At a slight nod from him, the lead shadow stepped forward, with a face like granite, He handed a thick leather-bound folder and a glowing iPad to Peter van der Merwe. I watched Peter's face as he opened the file. I watched his eyes scan the bank statements from Macau, the frozen asset notices from Singapore, and the high-resolution photos of the Vanguard shipping containers that held far more than wine. Beside him, his wife gasped, her hand flying to her throat as the digital evidence played out on the screen, a video of Cello's investors being detained by international authorities. The social carnage was silent, but total. Peter stood up. He didn't look at the priest. He didn't look at the congregation. He looked at Cello, and for the first time in his life, the patriarch of the van der Merwe empire looked truly murderous. He reached out, grabbed Claire's arm, and yanked her away from the altar with such force her veil snagged on a floral arrangement, tearing it away to reveal her shocked, tear-streaked face. "We're leaving," Peter growled, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Father," what Claire started, but she saw the iPad. She saw the truth. She looked at Cello as if he were something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. She didn't say a word. She simply turned and followed her father. The exodus was a mass movement of silk and wool. The old money guests, sensing the stench of a dying reputation, rose in unison. They filed out of the pews, moving past Cello as if he were invisible, their faces turned away in a collective act of social execution. Within minutes, the cathedral was empty, save for the priest, the shadows at the doors, and the three of us. Cello stood alone at the altar, surrounded by the rotting lilies. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a hollowed-out man in a rented suit. I walked up the altar steps, my obsidian dress whispering against the stone. I stopped 2 feet from him. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I looked at him with the cold, analytical eyes of a master fixer. "You told me once that I was too intimidating for the life you wanted," I said, my voice steady and resonant in the empty church. "You wanted a life built on a name you didn't earn, and a fortune you didn't build. You thought you could discard the architect and keep the palace. But a palace without a foundation is just a pile of expensive rubble, Cello." "Rethabilly, please," he croaked, his eyes darting toward Sangbum, who stood at the base of the steps like a dark god waiting for a sacrifice. "Don't." I cut him off. "You aren't a man anymore, Cello. You aren't even a scandal. You're a ghost. And I'm the one who finally laid you to rest." I turned my back on him, the gesture final and absolute. I walked down the steps to Sangbum. He didn't say a word. He simply opened his coat and tucked me into his side, shielding me from the cold draft of the cathedral as we walked toward the light of the open doors. Outside, the Cape Town wind was howling, whipping the salt air off the Atlantic and through the city streets. It was a wild, honest wind. I felt the weight of the last 6 months fall away, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful clarity. The contract was over. The revenge was complete. We reached the Maybach. Sangbum stopped, turning me to face him. The wind ruffled his dark hair, and his obsidian eyes were fixed on mine with a permanent, possessive intensity. "The flight is ready," he said, his voice a low, dark rumble. "But before we leave this soil, there is one thing that needs to be understood. The contract is fulfilled, Sangbum," I said, my heart beginning to race. "You have your merger. I have my justice. The world thinks we are a partnership, Rethabile," he said, stepping closer until our shadows merged on the pavement. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of my neck, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw. "But I've decided I don't want a partner. I don't want a fixer. I want a queen. And my throne has always been too big for one person." I looked up at him, at the ghost king of the Korean underworld, and realized that I wasn't afraid. I was home. "A queen comes with a heavy price," I whispered. "I'm a billionaire, Rethabile," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I can afford it." He leaned down, his lips claiming mine in a kiss that tasted of salt, power, and a future that we would write in blood and gold. As we headed to the private jet, the sound of the wind was the only thing left of Cello's world. The morning in our shared penthouse atop the Latte World Tower didn't begin with the clinical, lonely chill of my past life. The silence here was different now. It was the heavy, satisfied quiet of a predator's den. The air was a thick, intoxicating blend of my Bulgarian rose candles and the lingering masculine scent of Sangboom's wood smoke cologne. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of the master suite, watching the sun rise over the Han River. The water didn't look like a silver vein today. It looked like liquid gold, reflecting the empire we had spent the last 6 months solidifying. I was no longer the woman who lived behind a mask of professional perfection. I was the woman who had burned the mask and used the ashes to ink her name into the city's ledger. The dressing ritual was a deliberate act of war. I slipped into a suit of deep, bruised plum silk, the jacket cinched at the waist to emphasize a silhouette that had become a symbol of terror and respect in Seoul's financial districts. As I reached for my jewelry, a pair of large, scarred hands covered mine. Sangbum stood behind me, his chest a solid wall of heat against my back. He was already dressed in his signature charcoal armor, his presence so massive it seemed to warp the light in the room. He didn't speak. He simply leaned down, his lips grazing the pulse point at my neck, before he fastened the Keon emeralds, now my permanent signature, around my throat. "The dinosaur is waiting in the boardroom," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a familiar spark of adrenaline through my veins. "He thinks he's coming to a negotiation. He doesn't realize he's coming to an autopsy. Let him think what he wants," I replied, turning in his arms. I adjusted his silk tie, my fingers steady. It makes the fall much more cinematic. The journey to the Keon Global Tower was a display of absolute sovereignty. We moved in a motorcade of 6 armored vehicles, a black tide flowing through the morning traffic. When we stepped into the lobby, the atmosphere didn't just shift, it shattered. The staff didn't just bow, they folded, a wave of dark suits hitting 90-degree angles as we passed. The whispers followed us like a draft. The Ghost King. The Shadow Queen. We reached the 60th floor, the same boardroom where this journey had begun with a gold-embossed insult. As the double mahogany doors swung open, the scent of cold iron and wood smoke greeted me like an old friend. At the obsidian table sat CEO Park, a man who had built his fortune on the backs of traditionalism and the systematic exclusion of anyone who didn't look like him. He sat with his cronies, his face a mask of patronizing boredom. "Chairman Cheon," Park said, standing with a stiff, insincere bow. He barely glanced at me. "I was under the impression this was a private meeting between principals. I didn't realize you were bringing your associate." Sangbum didn't respond. He didn't even look at the man. He walked to the head of the table, pulled out the heavy leather chair for me, and then took the seat beside me, crossing his legs and leaning back with a terrifying, predatory stillness. He was a silent spectator to a play he had already seen the ending of. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the polished obsidian surface. I didn't wait for Park to sit. "Mr. Park," I began, my voice a silk-wrapped blade. "You've spent the last 3 weeks attempting to block the Hyundai merger by claiming my leadership role is a distraction to the shareholders. You've even gone so far as to suggest to the board that my background as a concierge makes me a security risk." Park chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "I'm merely a traditionalist, Miss Valentine. Surely you understand that a woman of your unique history is better suited for the hospitality wing than the boardroom of a global VC firm." I smiled. It was the smile of a fixer who had found the killing blow. "I spent 10 years fixing the lives of men like you, Park," I said, sliding a thin, matte black tablet across the table. "Which means I spent 10 years learning where you bury the bodies. If you look at the 3rd tab, you'll find the digital trail of the slush fund you've been using to pay off the mistress you keep in Jeju. Tab 4 contains the environmental violations your construction firm buried in the Busan redevelopment project. And tab 5? That's the direct link between your personal accounts and the short selling of your own company's stock." The color drained from Park's face, leaving him the shade of curdled milk. He looked at the screen, his hands beginning to shake, the same pathetic rhythmic rattling of silverware I had seen from Cello at the vineyard. This is blackmail," he gasped. "No," I corrected, my voice dropping to a dangerous low hum. "This is a hostile takeover. You will resign your position as CEO, effective immediately. You will sell your remaining shares to Cheon Holdings at 50% of market value. And in exchange, I won't send this file to the National Tax Service." I looked at Sangbum. He was watching me with a look of pure dark pride. He didn't have to say a word. The power in the room had shifted so violently that Park looked like he was about to collapse. "You have 10 minutes to sign the digital transfer," I said, standing up. "Or I hit send and we watch your legacy vanish before lunch." As we walked out of the boardroom, leaving a broken man in our wake, I thought briefly of the other ghost in my past. My fixer network still provided updates, though I had long since stopped asking. Cello was no longer the social king. He had been stripped of his name, his credit, and his pride. Last I heard, he was working as a junior valet at a mid-range hotel in Johannesburg, parking the cars of the men he used to pretend to be. He was a social pariah, a man whose presence in a room caused people to look away as if from a bad accident. He wasn't dead, but in our world, being forgotten was a far worse fate. We returned to the private office at the end of the hall. Sangbum turned to me, the city skyline of Seoul sprawling behind him like a conquered kingdom. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't offer me a diamond. He took my hand and slid a heavy, blackened gold signet ring onto my finger. It bore a combined crest, the Cheon phoenix entwined with a stylized, sharp-edged V. "The contract is ancient history, Rethabile," he said, his voice a dark caress. "This is the claim. You are the co-chair. You are the queen, and this city belongs to us." I looked down at the ring, then out at the glittering neon heart of Seoul. 6 months ago, I was a woman trying to survive a humiliation. Today, I was the woman who defined the hierarchy. The rain was starting to fall again, slicking the glass of the tower, but the wood smoke and iron in this room made it feel like a fortress. I looked at my reflection in the window, at the emeralds, the silk, and the lethal clarity in my own eyes. I was no longer fixing the lives of the elite. I was the one who decided if they got to have a life at all. I used to fix the lives of the elite from the shadows. Now, I own the light they bask in.
Thoughtful woman, love it, listening from Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks.